Let's move on to our next story. Early this week, Reuters published this report. It accuses Iran of exploiting, quote, earthquake missions to fly weapons to Syria, unquote. The report says that Iran used earthquake relief flights to bring weaponry and military equipment into Syria. The story begins on the 6th of February, when the mega quake struck Syria along with Turkey. Some 6,000 people died in Syria alone, and within days, flights from across the world took off for Syria, carrying all sorts of aid, humanitarian, medical. Among the many flights that landed, there were also flights from Iran. But apparently, these flights weren't carrying aid alone. These humanitarian flights were also carrying communication equipment, radar batteries, spare parts. What for? To upgrade Syria's air defense system. And all of this is really what the Reuters report is saying. But why would Iran want to upgrade Syria's air defense system? Because Tehran has big stakes in Syria's ongoing civil war. It has been fighting on behalf of and with the Bashar al-Assad regime. Now, ever since the war broke out, Western powers have slapped a whole host of sanctions on Syria. As for America, it's been slapping Syria with sanctions since 1979. That was when Washington designated Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism. On the 10th of February, the US suspended these sanctions for 180 days because of the earthquake. Now, the Reuters report quotes an Israeli defense official as saying, under the guise of shipment of earthquake aid to Syria, Israel has seen significant movements of military equipment from Iran, mainly transported in parts. Now, where exactly were these shipments delivered? Apparently, mainly in northern Aleppo. Now, what's the importance of this? Well, along with the recent tensions in Israel after the police action at Al-Aqsa, it potentially destabilizes the Middle East just as attention is starting to move to the multiple peace processes that are also going on. We've all heard about the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Now, Saudi Arabia seems to be making efforts to broker peace in other areas as well. Let's just take a look at what's been going on in the last few days.
The sands of West Asia are shifting again. Earlier this week, Syrian Foreign Minister Faiz al-Meghdad arrived in the Red City of Jeddah. This was the first such visit since the outbreak of the civil war and since Saudi Arabia cut ties with Syria in 2012. In Jeddah, Meghdad held talks with his Saudi counterpart, Prince Faisal bin Farhan. The two sides agreed to resume flights and consular services. Cut to Friday, Saudi Arabia hosted a regional meeting. It was attended by 9 countries, namely Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Iraq and Jordan. On the agenda was Syria and ending Syrian isolation. Is West Asia witnessing normalization of ties with Syria? Will Syria now return to the Arab League? It was suspended from the body in 2011 following the Bashar al-Assad government's crackdown on pro-democracy protests. The next Arab League summit is scheduled for the 19th of May 2023, and it will be hosted by Saudi Arabia. What are the chances Syria will be a part of the summit?
So war or peace, what's actually coming to the Middle East? Let me put that question to John Erath. He's a senior director at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. John, thank you so much for being with us. You must have seen this report about possible Iranian arms shipments to Syria. What's the latest that you can tell us on the situation on the ground there?
Yes. There have been reports that there are additional weapons going from Iran to Syria mixed in with some of the humanitarian assistance for the post-earthquake situation there. Iran has denied that it is providing such weapons in such a manner, but I don't think we have any way to independently verify whether or not this is happening. But that's not what's important here. What's important is that there are weapons that are finding their way to Syria and into the hands of the Assad regime, which has a terrible record of human rights violations, of violence against its own people, use of chemical weapons, use of thermobaric weapons, and other very inhumane kinds of things. So the presence of more weapons there is something that is of great concern.
But obviously, the fact is also that with the situation that we are seeing in Israel and the rising tension that's been there, including on the borders, there's always the possibility that some of those weapons can actually be used against civilian populations in Israel, for example, and that could further escalate tensions.
That, of course, is a possibility, and it's something that would be very bad. But also, the weapons are being used against civilian populations in Syria, and the presence of more weapons increases the danger that they could further leak across borders into neighboring countries and destabilize the entire region.
So I was just wondering about the rapprochement, if you like, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. How do you see that playing out? It could be, you could argue that Iran, with all that is happening towards peace there and other places, maybe it'll start being more moderate in some ways. Other people believe that it could embolden Iran and get it to take more aggressive steps. How do you see it playing out?
I think it's still rather early to evaluate what the further effects of the increased connections between Iran and Saudi Arabia will be. If Iran feels less isolated and less threatened, that's probably a good thing, and could lead to some moderation in the policies of its government. Saudi Arabia has said repeatedly that if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, then Saudi Arabia, would have to take corresponding steps. And that, of course, would be very hazardous for the entire region if there were more nuclear weapons present. So perhaps this rapprochement between the two countries might lead to some diminishment of those tensions.
Last question, what do you think is the worst case situation of what could happen with Iran and inside Syria, and what are the weapons that could have potentially been provided there?
The worst case situation would be if there is a further supply of weapons that goes in there, if Syria becomes a failed state and you have territory being taken over by basically armed terror groups with access to advanced conventional weapons that would be able to export this instability throughout the Middle East region.
John, thank you so much for joining us with that perspective.